I think the room capacity said 78. We should double check that. This is, the crowd always looks bigger from up front. I'm going to put this. Am I still audible okay with the mic a little bit lower? I'm really grateful for the music stand here. This is my current calling in church, is the sacrament meeting chorister, and my bachelor's degree is in music, so this is going to be my grounding for today. If I touch it a lot, that's what's happening. I'm grounding. I hope to have a really intimate conversation with the many faces I see in the room right now. This is a topic that means a lot to me, and I'm gonna be very personal with my clinical experience, as well as spend some time in the research to understand the Joyner model for understanding suicidality. So a couple outcomes, and the learning objectives, of course, are important. Why is it that we need to have a good foundational understanding of suicide in our clinical practices, and how this having a good solid foundation will actually prove to help save lives, but also when a suicide does occur. And I'm kind of curious, and you kind of reflect, if you've had a suicide in your practice, someone that's in your care, you understand what it's like to go through the after effect. And not only the legal, potentially the clinical, but also the personal after effect of having a client die by suicide. It can be very difficult. And what helps and what has helped, and research has kind of shown this, with a good understanding of what causes suicide, how we can intervene, it helps us with that question, did I do all that I could do? What did I miss? Right? And the doubts that kind of creep into our minds. We're going to do that through the understanding of this particular model. This is not the only model to understand suicidality, but it's one that gets a lot of attention, and I think has a very comprehensive view of real solid effect sizes for suicidal behavior. And then how is that going to look in our clinical practices? So I'm going to talk about some of the suicides that have occurred. As Dean said, I was an Army psychologist for 8 years. I served in the infantry. I had under my care 4,000 soldiers and officers, and I was in charge of their mental health. The year that I was in Iraq, 2008, 2009, the suicide rate for active duty soldiers finally got to the national average. Prior to that, being in the military was seen as a protective factor, and our rates had been about half the national average, about 10 per 100,000. But the year that I was in Iraq, a report was released showing that the suicide rates had now matched civilian rates, and people were very alarmed, and they have, in fact, surpassed. And the question was always like, well, what do we do? How can we be helpful? And that was often a very salient question. The problem was, like, understanding suicide is tricky because it's a low base rate phenomenon. And so the statistics are kind of funny, and they can be skewed in different ways. So one of the things that they found was that of the year 2006, of the soldiers that died by suicide, 75% of them had relationship problems. It sounds like a big effect size. Wow, this is the thing we need to glom onto. So commanders, in their efforts to help their soldiers and also potentially alleviate their own guilt, they would refer everyone to me that had been heard having a fight with their spouse on the phone. So this is problematic, and I had to explain low base rate phenomenon statistically to a bunch of infantry officers, right? Break it down, lowest common denominator, Online College of America, wherever they got their schooling. But the idea that 75% did die by suicide who had relationship, well, 75% of those who died by suicide had relationship problems. I kind of gave a brief breakdown that we have 100,000 troops currently in Iraq at the time. I said, so how many of them are in a significant relationship? And they said, well, most of them. Like, yeah, probably 80%, right? So 80,000 troops in Iraq at that year were in a relationship, a significant relationship. And I asked, how many would you guess are having strain or problems in that relationship? They said nearly all. I said, well, let's go maybe just half. So 40,000. So let's go 40,000, and I'm supposed to find the 22 who will die, or actually the 15 who will die by suicide out of 40,000 people. How do you do that? The predictive model breaks down when you start going the other direction, and it's problematic. So Towards the end of our time in Iraq, there were some suicides, and I'll talk about these cases. One was a young man that I met one time. He was on an outlying FOB, forward operating base, I'm sorry, an outlying FOB. And I'd seen him one time, did an intake. I came back a month later. He declined treatment, said he was doing really well. And then a month after that, ended his life on the FOB, and it was related to a lost relationship. With that came the scrutiny of my medical charts. Have you done your due diligence? And luckily I had documented and I had coded things, and at least on the level of administrative clinical practice, I was told, well, you're okay, Jeff. Thank you. I don't feel better, but thank you. The second suicide occurred with a soldier who was in Germany, who had never deployed with us to Iraq, but had contact with mental health. And then the third person was someone that I had treated throughout my entire deployment. And this young man, diagnosed with depression, worked with him. He had had a previous suicide attempt, but through the course of our treatment, he became very stable, very optimistic, and had really good indicators. And I was giving him an outcome questionnaire, the OQ45, about once a month to kind of track progress. I recorded the data. Things are going really well. He was going to go home from Iraq on the first group. We called it the first chalk. The first group that were leaving Iraq, he was on that. And he and I talked, like I was going to be in Iraq for another month and a half before I would leave. So access to care, documented that, how to cope with perhaps reintegration with your family, and of course alcohol had been a major problem. When he went home, all the things went wrong, and he did die by suicide. And again, under scrutiny. So now we had in our unit, within a month's time, 3 suicides that all had contact with mental health, and my brigade commander, a colonel, wanted to know why they had all had contact and why all of them died. He was under the gun, and so therefore I was under the gun. And it was problematic. So this is really what kind of moved me towards applying for a fellowship in the military regarding suicide and trauma, because it was very important. So the need for that well-documented care helps us with how we review our own practice, but at the time when you may get called into your boss's office, in this case a colonel, who wanted to ask me some questions about my clients. And what he had asked was, he said, well, first of all these people that had died, you called mild risk. I got a call from the brigade surgeon, the commander's medical advisor, who said, the commander wants to see all of your charts and notes for every soldier that you have called mild risk in the past year. This guy's name is Mike, Dr. Mike. You understand that's illegal, right? He's like, come on, Jeff, just do it. We all have when the commander hears no, we all have a bad day. I said, Mike, you're going to have a bad day. That's not legal. You can't do that, right? And he came back the next day, well, there's a regulation that says if there's in a war scenario, there can be a command need to know that can trump HIPAA laws and regulations. I said, great, find me the regulation. Of course, there's not one. But what I agreed to do was to go to my boss's office and let him know how I understand suicide and suicide risk. The reason why this was important was because he was not sure that I understood what mild risk looked like if people were dying that I had called mild risk. So I went into his office that day and I showed him my risk assessment form and my matrix. This is kind of complicated, but what this showed was that I actually have this, in this case it was a 5x2 matrix for how I label risk and how I assign risk based on the responses of the soldier, and I laid out for him a framework of understanding suicide and suicidal behavior. Once he saw this, what he told me was, you're doing a great job, and it sounds like we as commanders need to listen to your advice more often. Hallelujah. An enlightened infantry commander. So, but if it were not for this, I was facing a serious uphill battle with regards to understanding suicide. I'm going to talk about the third, because the third one really threw me off. This was a young man that I'd been treating for 4 months, diagnosed with major depression. He had not deployed, but he had come to our unit in Germany recovering from substance abuse. He had a heroin addiction that had been resolved before he joined. His father had died by suicide, which we know is a risk factor. and he had been homeless for a time. He was married to a woman that it was one of those marriages by who you knock up first. So he had chosen his wife because she got pregnant with his kid, but she, by all accounts, wasn't the greatest person. There was a lot of conflict with this relationship. And in the first 2 months of our treatment, he did attempt suicide. He attempted to overdose on Seroquel, which was a sleep aid. What he didn't know was that the dose he was on was good for sleep. The dose that he took to try to suicide would have helped him with any hallucinations or delusions he was having, but that was really it. He had a nice nap. But it was a serious attempt that triggered a response. He had some time in the hospital to make sure he was okay. And then treatment accelerated rapidly. I saw him twice a week. I pulled him out of his regular duties, gave him a lot of tools and worked with him, and he got so much better. Again, all accounts, everything was going great. The last time I visited with him, I met him in his barracks room to kind of do just a safety eval and make sure things were okay. One of the comments I made was, I saw his bed. I'm like, dude, where are your sheets? Are you just sleeping on this gross soldier mattress without sheets? And we kind of joked about it. When he died the next day, he actually had used his sheets to hang himself when I got that call. What had happened was, again, a fight with the wife. She told him flat that she was not going to return to Germany, and their relationship was over. And that hit me pretty hard because a person I was in direct contact with, and the things that I kind of learned from that, I was in shock for a little while. One of the problems was, as the mental health worker for the brigade, I was also in charge of checking in on the soldiers that were affected by the suicide, even though it was also me that was affected by the suicide. But I'll never forget the words of a psychiatrist whose office was next to mine. She said, "Jeff, sometimes mental illness is terminal." Sometimes mental illness is terminal. In another metaphor I had heard in a training I attended is that sometimes people can run marathons, they can eat all the right foods, and they can still get cancer and die. That sometimes we have negative outcomes despite all that we do right. And I want to kind of say that because it helped alleviate some of the guilt I was feeling and the shame that I was feeling. And again, my charts were reviewed by a fine-tooth comb, and in the military that means I was guilty until proven innocent, so that was kind of rough. Way to recover. But again, I had a theoretical background that I could fall into that helped me get through that period, but also helped me to understand how to move forward with other clients. So kind of understanding the Joiner model. So this is some of the premise. It's difficult to find, and before this was published, there really weren't any good models that understand suicidal behavior. A lot of one-directional correlations. For example, the vast majority of people who die by suicide have some form of psychological illness, but the vast majority of people with mental illness will never attempt suicide, let alone die by suicide. Right? One-way, one-directional correlations. About a third of people who die by suicide have chronic physical illness. However, the majority of people with these illnesses do not attempt suicide. And in fact, having a chronic illness does not by itself increase the risk for suicide. The best predictor still remains past behavior. But how do you kind of recognize the past behavior? Sometimes the past behavior, they only get one shot, and it's kind of it, right? And so that's kind of a risky business. So to better understand this, Joiner kind of found a lot of things. And one of the things that he found across the research was that social isolation was a strong variable for having suicidal thoughts, right? There are some empirically supported risk factors for lethal suicidal behavior, like agitation, hopelessness, and sleep disturbances. In fact, be mindful of people with insomnia. A lot of suicidal behavior happens after midnight, right? When the brain is a little bit not all on, right? Basically, the inhibitions are down, right? Similar with like substance use. We have in the base of our brain that survival instinct that's really hard to override. It's hard to overcome. Not sleeping, not eating properly, not fueling your body can help those defenses break down a little bit, making it more likely for a serious suicide attempt or behavior, right? So really the foundation for this is that people die by suicide because they can and because they want to. Because they can and because they want to. And this looks at a couple different pieces. How are they able to break down the ability to enact violence against themselves Have you ever tried to bite yourself and make yourself bleed? I've never been able to do it. I always stop, right? The part of my brain doesn't let me really clamp down, but other people have bitten me and I've bled, namely small toddlers with sharp teeth, right? In the documentary, The Bridge, they showed people, it showed their behavior on the Golden Gate Bridge, which is one of the top landmarks for suicidal behavior. And what they found was that people go there for the intent of dying, but still it takes quite a long time for them to actually die. They may pace back and forth across the bridge a few times. They may kind of put a leg over, they may look, they may lean. In the case of one young man who survived the fall, a tourist asked him to take their picture on the bridge. They're looking for any kind of social connection in this case. And with this young man, God, I can't remember his name. I meant to write that down. Thank you, Kevin Hines. He's on a speaking tour. Look up his YouTube videos. He had said that once he let go of the bridge, his instant thought was, I don't really want to die. He had regrets when he fell. Any of you who have had patients or clients who survive a suicide attempt, they may tell you the same thing. As soon as they took the pills, they called 911, right? There's that instant regret. To kind of overcome that, they have to have an increased ability to enact violence, and the Joyner model addresses that. So the three primary pieces to the Joyner model include thwarted belongingness, perceived burdensomeness, and those two together constitute where we find people that have higher rates of suicidal ideation, more thoughts of suicide, and especially the thwarted belongingness can be, when it's very severe, that severe isolation can lead to increased suicidal ideation by itself. And then the third part, that acquired capability, right? At least in one study, a meta-analysis in 2016 found that hopelessness could be part of this model as well. Right. The idea being that, and I'll kind of show this model. This is my attempts at graphics, so you're welcome. That between the perceived burdensomeness and the thwarted belongingness, if you have hopelessness, if there's not a chance that it's ever going to get any better, you increase the likelihood, and that helps with the acquired capability to enact violence on yourself. One of the quotes that I tried to find the source of this quote, I wrote it down in a notebook at a training, but suicide is not the problem, it's the perceived solution, right? It's the perceived solution. So how do we identify what the problems actually are, right? I'm going to take my watch off so I can track my time. Otherwise, I'll just ramble on all day, or I'll stop in a half hour. Anyway, I'm the last thing that you guys have before lunch, so maybe I should wrap up early so you can get in line for lunch first. I'm aware of that. All right. So let's kind of break down these constructs in bigger pieces, and then we'll talk about the latent variables behind each of the big constructs. The idea that, first of all, social connectedness is a human need that can actually be observed, right? We are, by nature, herd creatures. Anyone that has studied attachment theory understands the need for emotional or physical attachment to an individual, right? Sea turtles are nice. They can drop their eggs on the side of the ocean and say, hey, the water's that way, don't get eaten by a seagull. And that's the extent of parenting for a sea turtle, right? I have a 20-year-old who still lives with me, so we have a lot more work to do than sea turtles. Within this idea, so some of the latent variables that kind of are here include loneliness. And one thing that he describes is the absence of reciprocally caring relationships. You have clients that often complain that they give and never receive. These are attempts to connect that, when they're not reciprocated, indicate that thwarted connectedness, right? And this ought to be differentiated from people who naturally don't have high social needs, which should be part of the assessment procedure. Do you have high social needs? Maybe one or two friends is good for you, and that's all you really need. And we need to kind of respect that personality trait. But for people who are attempting, who are casting a line out into the water and drawing up empty every time, is important, right? We notice that with thwarted belongingness, this will vary over time. It's not a stable trait. And it's also understood dimensionally rather than categorically. So, for example, being married by itself is not enough. It's the quality of that marriage, right? Having friends is not enough, but to what extent are your friends reliable for advice, for support, for information, right? So we don't want to look at it categorically, number of friends, or if you're married, but really the quality of it, more on a dimensional approach. We know that chronic loneliness also is associated with a number of negative outcomes, right? Emotional outcomes and interpersonal states. For example, the negative emotions, pessimism, that fear of evaluation, shyness, lower levels of social support, agreeableness, and sociability. So when people become lonely chronically, it alters the way they feel about themselves, about the world around them, and other people, right? And it changes that to a darker, more negative sense of kind of who they are and the world around them. So looking at some of the latent variables that are here, first of all, we look at two primary latent variables, loneliness and then the absence of reciprocally caring relationships. Loneliness is sort of is an emotional feeling, right? So when people tell us they're lonely, understanding that it's going to come from their self-report, and it is subjective to where they're at. But it might also be related to being isolated, living alone, right? Lack of presence of supports. And then a lack of sense of people pulling together. Some people don't recognize the connections that are present, especially within the LDS culture, that we have a community feel. We call the bishop the father of the ward. But if you don't have that connection, and especially if you see other people with that connection, it stands in stark contrast to the lack of connection that a person might feel. And as I go along, if you have questions or comments, feel free. I prefer discussions. The other part of this has to do with the absence of these reciprocally caring relationships, and it could come from family conflict, right? We know that there is a problem within our culture, sometimes of ejecting family members out of our families for bad behavior or for lifestyle choices that we don't agree with. This will increase the risk of suicide. Right. There was a story that President Oaks told of a woman who wrote to him and said, my daughter came out as lesbian, and so of course, I told her to move out. She couldn't be in my home, my family, but she still persists in this lifestyle. What else should I do? His response was, call her and beg her forgiveness for the sin that you committed against your daughter. Right? Great response. He does have a heart, by the way. We also know that this can come from abuse in childhood. Abuse in childhood sets up a pattern for that individual of not knowing who they can trust, especially when we know that abuse in childhood is more likely enacted by someone that they know or trust, specifically a family member, right? And being mindful that this can set up a pattern of negative evaluations of the world, not knowing who to trust. In a number of cases that I've worked with, Dean mentioned that I worked for the Vet Center. Let me kind of clarify what that means. The Vet Center, we're part of the VA, but we're kind of a stepchild. My office is in Murray, not up by the main hospital, because for a lot of veterans, the VA hospital itself is traumatizing or triggering, right? We are designed to work with people coming out of combat zones and reintegrating them back into their civilian life. So we call it readjustment counseling. No one has told me how that's different from therapy, but that's fine. We also work with sexual trauma survivors from the military. So we don't treat the entire VA population, combat veterans, sexual trauma survivors. What I have found with my work with the sexual trauma survivors in particular is that they lose the ability to know who to trust and who they can turn to. Their barometer for trusting people gets very skewed. In some cases, they don't recognize good or bad, and because of that, they invite people into their lives to continue to perpetuate abuse, right? Because they don't know who to trust. One of my clients says that she brings people in, and then they have a look in their eyes, and she knows that she's about to be raped by a look in their eyes. But she's already brought them into her home and is in a very vulnerable position. So that abuse in childhood, I don't have anyone I can turn to, rely on. That mentality really shifts with that, and being very aware of the impact. And I will say that for many children who have been abused, that's not how they see the world, and we should not make assumptions, but always be asking questions for how they understand it, right? It can also happen with death or divorce. We know that a lot of people who die by suicide recently have divorced or separated from a significant other partner, right? Domestic violence, again, that same problem, and then social withdrawal. Are we checking with our clients to see about the social withdrawal? Are they pulling away from people? Are they isolating? Especially in places where we expect people to reach out, but are they isolating? Yes.
I should think that in the military, where there's such a stress, a sense of brotherhood, that thwarted belongingness is less likely in that population. Is that correct?
What happens in that population is kind of a bimodal distribution. People either connect super well or they just don't. And the ones that just don't are seen as outsiders and are ostracized by the group. And there can be active hazing, active alienation of that individual. I'll give you one example. There was a female that I worked with who was a flight attendant, and she worked for chartered airlines that was taking troops in and out of Iraq. And she saw the connectedness. She watched Band of Brothers. I can't tell you how many people joined the military because they watched the Band of Brothers series. And I thought, you didn't see how miserable that was? What were you paying attention to? But they paid attention to belongingness and connectedness. And this woman saw the connectedness and she wanted that. And when she got in the military, she did not get that connectedness. She was a very educated, outspoken woman and an E3 and a private. And she was a little bit older than the average private. And she had things to say to her sergeants who were younger, but in positions of authority in a very misogynistic society. And she was an outsider. And it was so poignant for her outsiderness-shiphood, that it really drove those suicidal thoughts. Like, everyone is connected but me. Right. And so in situations where we talk about connectedness and the family is important and our wards are important and our military units and our veteran brotherhood, if you are on the outside, it feels that much more painful. So you have the risk of really acute, that separation. So we were always mindful of the outsider. And when I would talk with commanders and their first sergeants, I would ask that question, who are the outsiders? Who are the people who are not fitting in? And how can I reach out to those individuals and get them help? And by the way, some people choose to be outsiders, and again, we don't make assumptions. This next aspect is really important, the perceived burdensomeness. The idea that the sum of my life is less than the sum of my death. One example, a soldier came in and said, hey, suicidal thoughts, yes, I have a plan. The idea is that I have a life insurance policy through the military worth $400,000. I will never make that in the military. My family will be financially better off if I die. I'm a drain on them. I am a terrible father, and I'm not a great husband. They're better off with the $500,000 and me being dead. To keep him alive, I did lie. I said the military doesn't pay out if you die by suicide. And he's like, ugh. And that gave me just enough time to do some life-saving interventions. And I feel badly because he trusted me and I just lied to him. Don't lie to your clients unless it's going to keep them alive. Or if you get them hospitalized, a soldier that was having delusions and hallucinations of a satellite keeping track of him, I told him that if he were to go to the hospital, the satellites they can't get into the hospital, that it's just at our particular locations where the satellites are monitoring people. Okay. But don't lie to your clients. Be authentic, be honest. Anyway. So believing that you're a burden on those around you is a really important link to understanding why people who are experiencing chronic illness or mental health problems or unemployment, why that drives suicide rates. Because again, your death is worth more than your life. I am more valuable dead than alive. Again, this also can vary over time. Certainly as employment status or health changes, this can vary, right? People often talk about the worst outcome for a soldier deployed would be if they died, but truthfully, the hardest outcomes are the ones that come back permanently disabled, right? And then they have to live. It's like, we're grateful you're alive, joyous and rejoicing, and then 6 months later, the daily reality of having someone care for you when you are the person caring for others can set in. And that especially with hopelessness, when you're a burden and it's not going to get any better, we're seeing lots of drivers for suicide. We noticed that comparing suicidal notes of those who made lethal and non-lethal attempts, that perceived burdensomeness was more likely to characterize the notes of those who died by suicide. In the case of the young man who died by hanging himself in the barracks, that he left a very lengthy note. And part of that note was that his wife was better off and his child was better in a world without him than with him there. And he talked about the thwarted connectedness, the lack of belonging in his unit. And I got to see the note because the last page was written just for me. And so I was able to kind of see his thought process. And I wish I had known this model then, because it was written in black and white, clear as day, what moved him towards suicide. This is kind of where we start to shape what are we doing in our clinical practice as we evaluate. And I will say that the guilt that I felt caused me to evaluate and be introspective to make changes, right? So that's kind of why I'm here. I will say that perceiving yourself as a burden on multiple others can have more fatal outcomes. And I'll talk about this because this kind of comes up. So two main variables that come from this, the liability, my death is worth more than my life to others, right? And this could come from being homeless, incarcerated, unemployed, or ill. But also people who feel expendable or unwanted. This is again where throwing our LGBT youth out of our homes is a bad idea. It's a bad idea because it increases that sense of burdensomeness. And I'll give you some of the comments that have been told to me in counseling or other settings that you are the reason why our eternal family won't make it to the celestial kingdom, right? How embarrassing would it be for our neighbors to find out that you're gay? Wouldn't that be awful, right? So we're putting burden on people that they are worth more away from us than towards us. Working with the task force with the governor for reducing suicide, especially in youth, we have to kind of change that narrative of how we interact with people in our own families. And even reaching out to those who might be around us. One of my ward members has a transgender sibling that they've decided not to accept. And so now they come to our house for family dinners, and she's wonderful. I don't see what the problem is. She's absolutely delightful. But when they sing happy birthday to her and they use a male name, why are you celebrating this person if you can't even call them by their name? Doesn't make any sense. Okay, I'll get off that topic. All right. The other variable here has to do with self-hate, that low self-esteem, shame, blame on oneself, and then also agitation, right? That you have to act. And this is where the link between antidepressant medication and suicidal behaviors, because a lot of people who have major depression don't have the energy to enact a suicidal plan. They get on the medication, their energy levels go up, and now they can enact their plans, right? And this really only occurs with the most severely depressed individuals, so it's not across the board, but always be mindful. And I'll kind of explain a case at the end of this that will illustrate this as well. And I also want to kind of debunk the myth of low self-esteem. Self-esteem should be thrown out as a concept. It says in D&C 19 verse 10 that the worth of souls is great in the sight of God, and there's no qualifier, right? Worth is worth. Our young women say it all the time, I am of infinite worth, right? Our young men need to be reciting the young women's values, I think, every week. Maybe we'll integrate that now because things are changing. I would like our sons to learn that. But the idea that your value can't change by accomplishment, by achievement. Any NPR listeners? One of the local underwriters has a commercial on NPR, the Challenger School, improving your child's self-worth through achievement. And I want to scream every time I hear that. Their worth is not dependent on their achievement. Get that idea gone. You might be better off if you achieve more, and you might feel a sense of accomplishment, but your worth has not changed, and it should not be tied to achievement. Anyway, soapbox, perceived burdensomeness. Okay. This third concept has to do with the acquired capability. Again, the idea that you can enact violence on yourself is a hard thing for people to accomplish, right? Because we have to kind of overcome that biological need for self-preservation. If I'm sitting with someone who's highly suicidal and I suddenly jump at them, they're still going to block me. Self-preservation is going to kick in, right? And so they acquire that capability through a number of different things. First of all, this is where the idea that the biggest predictor of suicidal behavior is past behavior. If you've already done it once, you know how to overcome that. People who die by suicide by cutting their arms open have smaller cuts to be found left and right as they acquire the capability to do the main one. With the soldiers and veterans, they would practice with their guns. They would load and unload. They would put it to their head, unload it, and see if they could even pull the trigger. They're practicing. They're engaging in rehearsal behavior that is increasing the likelihood that they can enact an act of violence against themselves, right? Because according to interpersonal model, through habituation, we can overcome that natural desire for self-preservation. Increasing the number of pills that one can swallow, practicing, we can overcome that inhibition, right, through that repeated practice. The other things that are linked to this are, for example, childhood abuse. Again, if you have if you have been abused and you disregard your body in less of a sense, you have less inhibition to keep yourself alive, right? We know that combat exposure, if you have practiced firing a weapon at another human being, it's easier to fire it on yourself, right? Impulsivity is a big problem, and this was especially with like special forces units. They would never tell you, they would just go do it. I saw one gentleman from a special forces unit who had attempted suicide and should have died if it were not for a miraculous intervention by a person. But he had a great attempt. He had everything lined up. And I should have never met this guy. But through a miraculous intervention, I did. But the impulsivity, and this is why men more often die by suicide than women, as men are more impulsive. Right, and men are more likely to enact suicide with lethal means than women.
I've got a thought, especially in the military, it's considered weak to ask for help.
Absolutely.
Either you're going to do it or you're not going to do it.
Right. So, and people would say that if you're going to die, just die. Right. They see stories of a person on a bridge hesitating and traffic gets stopped and like, just jump already. Right. This idea that just do it. Right. People encourage this, and especially in toxic masculine cultures. And it's a weak thing to even ask for help or to not do it. And I've heard even commanders say that was such a weak attempt. 10 Tylenol? Come on, try harder. I'm like, no, don't try harder. Please don't try harder. Yes?
I'm just curious if you found a link between history of dissociative symptoms specifically and increased risk of suicidality.
I have not, so a question was about a link between dissociative symptoms and suicidal behavior. I have not seen that particularly. But I can see where that would fit with that acquired capability, right? Depersonalization, derealization, if you're out of your body and it's not your body, it could increase if everything else is kind of aligned as well. Mm-hmm.
It's a loaded question, but it's about evil spirits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And their impact.
Evil spirits and their impact. I always tell people I don't have the corner knowledge on things, all matters, right? And I do believe personally the presence of evil spirits. One bishop told me that he was experiencing a depressive episode and he raised his arm to the square and he cast out Satan and his depression vanished. And I said, that's great, Bishop. I'm happy that happened for you. Please don't tell that to people who are depressed, though. Because not only are they depressed, but they're also unworthy and they're possessed by Satan. So how we kind of talk about that, I think, and people will often describe this as a spirit, especially people from, I've heard this from a few people from Hispanic cultures or Latin American countries, where it's sort of that spirit that can occupy them, right? And in those cases, the intervention might be, so how do you rid yourself, right? So I'm a very client-centered, humanistic, existential kind of guy. So if a person says they see things or feel things, let's go with it and see where it takes us. That's a good question.
I'd really like to have more time to explore the dissociative issue. It was brought up a minute ago because we found that as we were able to participate in dissociative pain removal successfully and dramatically in short time with recipes, that the symptomologies that we're talking about here often go away. So why are we not talking about it at that level where with the pain relief, the symptomology goes away?
Yeah, so and this kind of goes to the point of treatment. What is it that we're focusing on, right? And I'll be very curious to see, and I'll go do some research later today probably, or if a class later this afternoon is boring. But I'll to kind of see what there is about that, because that could be interesting to find out. But you're right, if you are addressing the drivers of suicide, then the risk for suicide goes down. So if via dissociative means maybe you're talking about hypnosis, or
More or less.
they're using Circle K or ketamine.
There's only about 30 different methods.
Right.
You can listen to Bruce Lipton and lots of other people, Bessel Van Coke, Dr. Dean. There's a whole bunch today that are on the forefront of this particular
Right.
documentation and history and measurements.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Why are we not seeing this at the level of the vet? He's such
Yeah.
an enormous population that y'all have, exposure to.
Right. I think the simple answer is we are always reluctant to change and try new things. As a profession
It
sometimes as
sounds
well.
like, the answer to why don't we do our self-care?
Right.
Because we're human. Well, that's
Right.
not the excuse, that's the reason why.
Right. Thank you. You had a question too, I believe? All right. So great point. We're gonna kind of how this is gonna kind of play out, right? But again, the idea that you can engage in habituation and what they call opponent processes with regard to you're increasing your pain tolerance and decreasing your sense of fear about death, right? This is where small children engage in suicidal behavior after the death of a parent. Well, mommy has gone to a better place. Oh, I'm not afraid of dying anymore. I want to go to the better place too, right? Or some of the narrative that the LGBT individuals in our church won't be gay or transgender in the afterlife. They may seek the afterlife sooner to get to that place now because they can't tolerate how it feels now in our culture to be in that position, right? And teenagers are ending their lives because they don't have that fear of death. They're looking for the next best thing to happen to them, right? So a couple things, the habituation, really that's previous behavior, a family history of suicide. I will tell clients a lot of times that we assess for that because they can run into family lines, and it could be because of the genetic predisposition for depression, how your serotonin sensitivity, that sort of thing, but also just the fact that what we call disinhibitory contagion, that when you see people around you doing a thing that's not socially desirable, it increases the likelihood that you engage in that same behavior. And this explains the phenomenon of cluster suicides. Anyone associated with Harriman High School or Lone Peak High School know exactly what I'm talking about. I was out in Elko, Nevada. We work within the vet center. We travel to rural communities and do treatment. And while I was out in Elko, Nevada, I learned that their suicide rate was 4 times the national average. Right? They had 80 per 100,000. They had 40 suicides that year in a town of 50,000 people. And a lot of them were at the school, but so we know that will disinhibit someone, and it helps with habituation. And then the opponent processes, right? Lowering the fear of death and elevated pain tolerance, right? It won't hurt so much, and so they're not nearly afraid of engaging in these behaviors. So how does this look in an LDS population? I'll be kind of curious about your feedback. I do have a case that I can review in a minute if we don't get a lot of traction on this. But what are the implications for treating individuals who have mental illness in an LDS population, right? Typically, we find that religion is a protective factor, or engaged in a religious organization, even more so than just general spirituality, because it helps with that connectedness. But again, what happens when a person leaves the faith community? How do we treat people who are outside that faith? A lot of my veterans come back from war and they've lost their faith. And now they're outsiders living in this valley, and I see them covered in tattoos and piercings with, a lot of markers that don't indicate choir boy. And I'm like, what is it like for you to live in Salt Lake Valley, coming back to your family that is still very religious? Are you an outsider? How are you accepted? And it's very difficult, right? And giving them that courage to kind of be themselves, it's important, right? So anyone that's kind of on the fringe, lacking inclusiveness, and this goes to the comment earlier, if in societies that have connectedness, if you're on the outside, it can make that lack of connectedness even more poignant. Right, yes.
I think in the LDS community, not only the LDS community, but in the Rocky Mountain culture, doesn't matter what the question is, the answer is work harder.
Right. Do more.
Yeah, and I think that's isolating in and of itself before any of this occurs, is that whole concept of I can do it.
Yeah.
And if I'm not doing it, I just need to be tougher, work harder, do more.
Right, which was great when they were settling this valley. Right. And they were planting trees and making things grow in this desert. Every tree I see in Salt Lake, I'm always amazed by, right? Because that hard work, I'll take care of it, we'll keep it internal, is sort of the attitude. But it's okay to ask for help, and we have a culture where it's not necessarily, because, right, we have a scripture that says wickedness never was happiness. So what's the inverse of that? If you're unhappy, you're doing wicked things. So now I'm not only depressed, but I'm also unworthy and unrighteous. And now I need to do more things like read my scripture, say my prayers, do what my stake president calls the dailies, right? And I don't bash that. I think those are great. But if you're telling a depressed person they need to do more things, it's not going to help that sense that they are a burden, and the pain goes higher and the hopelessness gets higher.
I think because LDS people tend to be doers, you really want to teach them about thoughts. And there are scriptures about managing your thoughts.
Absolutely, yeah. So managing thoughts, not just being doers, but managing thoughts, and that part of it's really important as well.
Thoughts and sense of
Right.
I'm not anti-thoughts, but I am pro-thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. I happen to believe
Right.
that there's more accomplished through feeling shifting and mood shifting and healing than there is in any of the other modalities, but they all work
Yeah.
at different speeds. If you want the high speed, get the feelings managed and regulated.
Yeah. So let me show you this really fast. There are assessment tools that can be used based on the interpersonal model. This is the 10-item question that you can use. There are other versions that go up to as many as 25 questions. They find that the research shows that the 10-item works well. And I don't know how copyrighted this is. I kind of copied and pasted it from an article, but I cited the article, so we're good, right? So I don't know if this can just be printed and replicated for copyright issues, but questions like, there are days in my life that people would be better off if I were gone, right? To what extent are these things true? These days I feel like I belong, right? We can ask these questions and help us develop a framework of understanding for how we're going to kind of go forward. And it's kind of blurry. I apologize for that. So let me give you a case. This is, let's call him Jones. I'll call him Jonesy. He's a good guy. He's a 56-year-old veteran of Iraq, multiple deployments within the National Guard. And with this case, I found all sorts of, I started treating him 4 years ago, and highly suicidal when he first came in. Part of it had to do with rejection by his family of origin. He was placed in foster care at a pretty young age when his mother became very distant and his father was very abusive. While in foster care, he was separated from his brother. In fact, he says one day he got on his bike and rode his bicycle all the way across Seattle to find his brother and kind of see his brother. So he had some family connectedness problems. They were eventually reunited in their father's house, but like I said, it was very abusive. When he was young, he witnessed the death of his brother. They were playing in a construction site and a concrete pipe rolled and crushed his brother, right? So he saw a very graphic death at a really quite young age. But he had estrangement from his adult children. Because of the way he was raised, he didn't have great parenting skills, right? I try not to do these things, but when his kids were acting out, he became kind of angry. And so as adults, they didn't want much to do with him. And then getting out of the National Guard, he lost his camaraderie. So I immediately noticed that there were strong elements of that thwarted belongingness. As a burden, he had chronic pain. He had so many physical ailments. We kind of even joked after he stopped being quite so suicidal. We kind of even joked that there's no way he could die by suicide because he's tried to kill himself just by the way he lives his life, and he's never died yet. He had fractures in his skull that were leaking cerebral spinal fluid out of his nose, right, from a fall that he had sustained in the 1980s. I'm like, I've never even heard of that one before. You find the most odd ways to damage your body, right? And after the suicide threat had passed, it became kind of a joke, but at the time it was very serious, his pain. The chronic depression and PTSD made it difficult for him to maintain employment, right? And difficulty with having a paycheck. He kept getting fired or his body would give out because he was very handy, he could build things. He had studied to be an electrician for a period. He could weld, but for a 56-year-old man with chronic pain, this wasn't a great long-term plan for income, right? And so he had a lot of guilt over his unemployment as well as his parenting. And then this acquired capability. He had multiple suicide attempts, 3 in total that I can count, right? Part of his capability was that he had very detailed plans on how he would die. And he would say, Jeff, one day I'm just not going to come in here and they're never going to find my body. And I'm like, ugh. He knew the wildernesses really, really well. He knew where to go and he knew what to do. At one point when his service animal died, he'd had this animal for 15 years. he had actually dug a grave for the animal and a way for him to be in there as well, where he could die, and then it would cover, there was an automatic process that would cover him with dirt and again, never be found, right? So very graphic, and by doing this, he was acquiring that capability to finally carry out a plan, right? And of course, the childhood maltreatment. So then one day he comes into my office, happy as a clam. Hey, Jeff, doing great. I'm like, uh-huh, right? And I got, like, my spidey sense was triggered. I'm doing great. I just wanted to say thanks for all your hard work. It's been wonderful. I'm like, Jonesy, sit down. You're not leaving my office. He's like, no, I'm great. I'm good. I'm like, I don't think you are. And I kept him engaged in conversation because everything was kind of, in that moment, all these things coalesced, right? And I said, what's your plan for after you leave here? He's like, I can't tell you that because then you'll put me in a hospital. I'm like, uh-huh. And this kind of confirmed that you're not leaving my office for quite a while, right? He said, but don't call the cops because you don't want a scene. I'm like, that's probably true. He would be the kind of person who would create quite a scene. So I just kept him talking, right? He had come to say goodbye. He finally confessed that he had come in and he had a resolved plan. He had made the preparations for that plan, and I was kind of the last check, right, to say goodbye. What I noticed in that moment, though, was that I had a tool to reverse the thwarted belongingness, at least with me. He and I had an attachment. He and I had a relationship. I would violate that if I called the cops and had him hauled off in handcuffs, which I was willing to do to save his life, but I knew that would be the end of our relationship, potentially. But I said, you know what, in my mind, I'm like, I've got a connection with this individual who came to say goodbye. How can I use that connection to help him feel like it matters to me that he lives or dies? And that kind of guided our conversation. I can't recall the details. At the end of the day, I said, you know, Jones, I can't stop you from dying, and if you want to do it, you can do it. I can't stop that. But I have this treatment that's really great, right? I have this world-class treatment that is designed to help people that who are suicidal, and I was in my mind kind of going through this idea. And can we just try that first, and if it doesn't work, then you can die. The problem is if you die first, I can't treat second. So there's an order of events that has to occur. And I used our relationship to say, let me just give me 3 months so we can identify what these elements are and address them directly in therapy. Give me 3 months, and then if you're still in the same place, we'll see what happens then. Of course, that was kind of a bluff because I probably wouldn't let him do it then either. But so we found the drivers that were there. He was at this intersection. So we found of those elements what it was that was driving him towards suicide. What was the thing that he was trying to solve through his death, right? And we spent about 2 months actually kind of going through this. By the end of the 2 months of directly kind of exploring these ideas, he finally said that my suicide no longer makes any sense. If this is why I want to die, that doesn't make any sense. And that's when you know that you've kind of gotten to a place where things have been kind of resolved. I also pulled from, if you know the David Jobs, the CAMS, the Collective Assessment and Management of Suicidality, I pulled from that literature as well. I was going to give him everything, like I promised, world-class interventions to address it directly. And that's the conclusion he came to. We have, I think, just a couple of minutes. But I'd be curious to hear kind of your thoughts, your reactions, experiences that you've had that have been helpful, or we could just have lunch. Yes?
I just want to say I really appreciate the thoroughness of your ability to communicate with us what you just shared, and also the content. I think it's very, very useful. I was just thinking back about somebody who got really happy.
Yeah.
Blue Sunset, a young girl, after she was done with me, she was so happy, and I'm sure capable of thinking she might have met me again why she went ahead and did it.
Right.
Never had it happen before, but not much was post. But it's a sad story for me.
Yeah.
But, so I appreciate the content of this. The part that I really want to go, would you please do the next hour on the treatment modalities?
Yeah, so find these elements and address them. Let me answer really fast. I appreciate the opening hymn this morning. And I jotted it down as they were singing. Trim your feeble lamp, my brother. I often feel that my lamp is very feeble, and I'm very humble with sitting with a person, being given their most precious gift, to see them in a very intimate way. There's someone out there trying to make the harbor. In the darkness, they may be lost. And then it says, let the lower lights be burning. The lower lights, meet them where they're at. Don't shine way up here. God loves you. A battalion commander attended one of my suicide classes and said, you got to tell those soldiers to put on that uniform, stand in front of a mirror, and be proud to be an American. I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, that's up here. I need to meet them where they're at. Let the lower lights keep burning. Send a gleam across the waves. Right? Find them where they're at. Find the turbulence and shine light there. Don't shine light in the place that they're not at. They will not see it. If you've ever been walking at night and headlights blind you, too much light in a dark situation will blind you and not provide you any assistance, right? My nickname in Iraq, when everyone was getting cool wartime names, you know what they called me? Sunshine. They'd get on the radio, hey, this is a commander, blah, blah, hey, Sunshine, you out there? I'm like, come on, can I get a manly name here, please? But then I realized that there are worse things than to provide people with light and provide them light where they're at. And that's the purpose of this model. Meet them where they're at with their risk factors and shine some light into their dark places that they can understand. I'll take 2 comments and then we really got to wrap up. Yes?
Would match the connectedness they have in the military. The intensity of that is very difficult.
It's very difficult. And so we have to work on moderating expectations because they're not going to get that. And that's the reality. So radical acceptance. This is where you're at right now. Civilians don't interact like that. You can have a block party, and they may come, they may not, but it's different than a military barbecue where everybody shows up and everybody engages. So we're going to moderate your expectations for life as a civilian versus what you had in the military because we can't replicate that. Yes?
What do you do for your own self-care and recovery following suicide?
Well, that was tricky. Thank you. That's a whole session by itself. I think it'd be a good panel sometime for those in positions of power. I've sat on this panel before. It's very powerful. Self-care after a suicide by a patient. There were 3 of us that presented a panel a number of years ago when I was in the military still with our interns and residents and fellows because that's a big topic. I can talk with you offline if you want because that's super important. Yes? Yes. Yes. Jean
Jeff.
has that.
Jeff, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Brothers and sisters, send me an email, and I will send you the PowerPoints. And they will also be on the AMCAP website in a month.
And I didn't change too much between